Here we go, 2022, back again. A few more grey hairs according to the camera. So today we're going to talk about some current issues that are facing businesses, and there's a lot of things that have happened over the break, as you've said, Ashley, and a lot of new issues that are emerging. So most of the borders might be open. So there are some state-based support packages available from the various state governments, but the major federal packages have all come to an end.
Yep.
We're now looking at letting international tourists back into the country, but you'd have to say that things are hardly what you'd call normal.
No.
Before we get into some of these issues that we want to talk about today, though, Ashley, what's been going on in the business environment and what have you seen over the break?
Yeah, well, I think probably a couple of the big, there's been no major insolvency changes that have happened in there wasn't any new legislation that popped up at midnight on New Year's Eve or anything like that. But we are seeing a marked increase in particularly private credit, so trade creditors, the fintech starting to take action on businesses now. I think the patience of the last 18 months is wearing thin. They waited to get through the new year and are now starting to show a little bit of form. And we're seeing a lot of clients who are getting demand letters. So you're not seeing it in the courts yet, but certainly the pressure is being mounted on people. The other thing that has, the other interesting fact that's come up, or the latest numbers, is that the ATO is now saying that their debt book is up to 55 billion.
Wow.
So the ATO has definitely, over the last 18 months, been a lifesaver for a lot of businesses. By not pushing to get paid, it's become that unofficial overdraft that you and I have talked about a lot. So we're seeing those numbers and seeing from clients some fairly large ATO debts. And although the ATO is not really pushing hard yet, there is an increase in trying to make sure that people are reporting and all the rest of it. At some point that's going to become an issue. But at the moment, they're still being very generous and looking after people. So, but it's quite staggering how big that number's become. The other big thing, I guess, that most of you would have probably seen over the Christmas break is that business confidence has fallen dramatically. I think the NAB index, the NAB business survey for December is showing it fell 24 points. I'm not much of a macroeconomic sort of guy and all the games that go on in that macro world, but there's no doubt that there is a business confidence, and that wasn't even with the full effect of Omicron, because that was released for December's numbers. So I think there's certainly some pressure coming on businesses. Another survey, which is done by the Creditor Watch Business Risk Index, they're certainly saying that Santa didn't come to a lot of businesses in the hope moving forward into this year, and that they're actually seeing that there's a 45% year-on-year contraction in business trade receivables. So, which is a significant amount of money in the economy. And their expectation from their report is that there will be an increase in defaults and insolvencies moving into this year. And there's a couple of reasons for that, which we'll talk through today. Although I think in general, there's still some optimism out there, but I think there's that contractioning that the business risk survey was talking about is going to have flow-on effects moving forward.
Well, this month's invoice is, tomorrow's debtor collection, and if they're down 45% year on year, that's a tough situation. So, as you say, Ashley, very uncertain times, and I think the uncertainty is one of the worst things that all businesses have had to endure during this COVID period. Is just the uncertainty. You think things are coming good, and then before you know it, you're back where you were 6 months ago. So let's talk about a few of the major issues that we're seeing with our clients that are facing their businesses. And today we want to talk about supply chain problems, about staffing issues, and the effect of this unofficial or quasi lockdown that we're in at the moment. So let's start with supply chain, Ashley. What can you tell us about what you've seen there?
Yeah, it's a bit beyond toilet paper.
Yes, the shelves are empty again of toilet paper.
I'm not sure that there was ever a shortage of toilet paper. It's just sitting in everyone's houses. But look, supply chain is an interesting one because you see it on the front page of the papers, and we've all looked in the Woolies and the Coles, and we're seeing that certain products aren't on the shelves anymore, and there's a lot more bare shelves than there were. But the impact on supply chain is a lot more than just retail. It impacts in all sorts of businesses, and a lot that you wouldn't even think about. Woolworths is predicting that it's going to that they're going to have a $4 billion drop in their value because of the lack of this drop in sales that it's going to achieve. Now that flows through to share market issues and all sorts of things when you have that type of impact coming through.
Yep.
And things like there was a quite big news in November, December, and early January about AdBlue. Now, I had a diesel car. At one point there, before I understood what AdBlue was, I actually thought that I was not going to be able to drive my car. But and the way the press made out, it was obviously you felt like that. Luckily, my car's old enough that AdBlue's not an issue with it. But from a whole transport network was worried that it was going to need to shut down. Now there's still pressure on the AdBlue one, but it has come off from the fear it has. But that type of supply chain issue isn't just about what's on the retail. It was meant that you couldn't get supplies for building. You can't get supplies in for all sorts of industries. And then you add natural disaster supply chain issues. At the moment, we've got a client who he's in the transport space, can't send anything west because the one rail line is flooded and it's been washed away by floods. So all of those impacts on the supply chain flow through to all types of businesses.
Yeah. I even read a report that members of shooting clubs are having to cut back on their competitions because they can't get bullets. There's a supply chain issue on that.
Well, I'll leave that one alone.
Yeah. So a very tough situation, as we said, Ashley, and lots of uncertainty. What impact have you seen from this, Ash?
Yeah, so what the big thing with the supply chain is that it doesn't necessarily affect you today. Like if it's going in to buy some oranges and the oranges are in a supply chain issue, then that's an issue today. But for a lot of businesses, it's actually not going to impact them for a couple of months because their revenue might drop by 20% because they can't get work out the door, because they can't get the nuts and bolts that they need to finish it off, or they can't get the steel or the timber, all of that, any type of different componentry. So therefore, they can't complete the work, which means that they can't invoice the work. And in most businesses, you're talking about a 30, 60, 90-day cycle before your accounts receivable is paid. So the cash flow impact is actually probably hasn't even happened yet for a lot of this supply chain issue. You can see it in the revenue lines, but in a lot of micro businesses, and we often talk about the cash is king. Cash is still looking okay in January because that's related to November.
Right.
So the issues are going to kick in February and March.
I think we're seeing some pricing issues as well, aren't we, with supply?
The great world of supply and demand is pushing things up, and you can buy some stock and then sell it to your competitor for 20% more. And I've even heard of some competitors in competing industries are actually buying the stuff to sell rather than actually being out there building. Yeah. So they're recovering their revenue in other sources now. So and again, a lot of businesses are forced into paying the higher price because they need to get an invoice out. So they need to complete the job. And in the building industry particularly, where there's been a lot of fixed price contracts, we're seeing a lot of defaults happening in that space now because they're actually building houses and doing construction work at losses.
Yeah.
But it takes time for that to roll through the system.
I think the other thing, Ash, is that you can't necessarily predict a supply chain interruption. It could happen really quickly. You might be fine on Tuesday and you've got a massive problem on Wednesday. So makes it very tough. And you use the example of building companies and construction related companies that have had a lot of problems. And they've recently failed either because they can't complete projects because they just can't get the material, or the cost of that material has gone through the roof. So those fixed price contracts, they're now losing money on them. There's not a lot that a business can do about that, though, is there, Ash?
Well, no, not really. I think it's about a planning issue. So it's, from our point of view, it's about talking about that plan B, that if something is to go wrong, are you prepared for it? Do you have a backup plan? If there are going to be business interruptions, how do you deal with those? And, in the business interruption issues that we had 2 years ago, the governments were very supportive and actually gave us labour protection for dealing with business interruption. Well, we don't have that anymore. So, dealing with staff is a big issue. The amount of times I've had clients coming into me talking about, I've got staff sitting around in the factory with nothing to do. Some of them have used up all their leave, so they don't have leave. And, there's all sorts of issues that flow through from that. So having a plan for that, but probably, and again, more in our space, Phil, we're talking about people who are really on the ropes. It's more about what if the consequences of that business interruption, have we got protections in place to manage against those consequences?
Okay, so let's digress a bit for a minute and just have a quick chat about that. Let's say you're a business owner and you have no supply chain issues or other issues at the moment. What sort of things could you do just in case something goes wrong?
Well, from a protection point of view, and you and I have spoken about this many times over the last 18 months while we've been in this new forum on the web. We've been talking about it for 10 years otherwise, but, is making sure you understand what your personal, for a director, what their personal issues are. What guarantees have you signed personally? What capable interests have you provided? What are your potential exposures? I talked before about the ATO being used as as a safety net for people. Are they actually still lodging, or have they created new liabilities for themselves through the director penalty notice regime?
Right.
So understanding that is probably one of the first things you can do.
So once you understand that, and you and I have spoken about this at length before, and I've worked here for near 10 years, and I think in that whole time I had one person that accurately knew who he'd guaranteed and who he hadn't, which is, and it can be a real shock, not only for the director, but often for their family members, their spouses, that don't realise that they're in the situation they're in. So let's say I understand where my liabilities are. I understand what I've guaranteed. I understand that there's risks of caveats on my family home, and I know where I'm at with the ATO and directors' penalty notices. What's the next step in trying to do something about it?
Yeah, well, some of it is around that personal asset protection. Like, do you have equity in your house? Have you structured that the right way? Is it in your in the non-risk takers? Careful not to say the wife, because sometimes it's the other way around.
Sometimes, yeah, absolutely.
But in the non-risk taker's name, and if the title's been transferred, has it been transferred properly? Who's paying the mortgages to make sure that we're not creating new liabilities? Who owns the vehicles? Making sure that you're looking at those asset protection things. Again, a lot of small businesses, the mum and dads, both people's cars are in the business, and if the business is in trouble, all of a sudden they may not have a car to drive to take the kids to school and to drive around and do that sort of thing. So having a look at all of those protections that are there, not because you need to do it, it's not necessarily the world's going to blow up tomorrow, but knowing that if it is to blow up, that there's one less thing you need to worry about because you already have some protections in place.
And, you and I have had comments from our audience before about houses, and comments like, I transferred the house into my spouse's name, so that makes it safe. Yeah. And that's just not true. It's that's the difference between legal interests and equitable interests. It's about, if you want to put the house in another name or deal with the equity in another way, it's not as simple as just changing the name on the title deed. No. All right. No. So if you understand where your risks are, you understand who owns what and what assets are at risk. What sort of things do you need to consider when managing those risks?
Yeah, so I guess we just sort of stepped out of the business and look at how you protect the director personally, and then stepping back into the business now is, the big one, as you know, comes up all the time is the ATO. Obviously, is making sure you understand what the ATO debt structure is, where those risks are for director penalties, and making sure that you have a plan for either paying it or protecting against it. Having a look at your credit relationship, the credit agreements, working out if they are the right ones.
Yep.
Maybe even using now to refinance and restructure some of those credit arrangements, hopefully putting you in a better credit position. I was dealing with a client the other day who's got finance out, and we worked out that they actually they had a reasonably good structure, trusts and what have you. But it turns out that they'd signed personal guarantees for all the shareholders of the company.
Wow.
So wives and other parts of the business were caught up because they'd actually wanted further guarantees than just the director guarantee.
That's a warning sign, isn't it? That's something you need to be careful of.
So we're looking at refinancing to try and get back to a better structure for that sort of thing. Dealing with the equity in the family home if it hasn't been dealt with before. Looking at what we over the last 18 months, I've seen a lot of business owners putting money back into their business, making sure that if you are going to, and had an accountant on the phone yesterday who's got a client who's going, I'm going to put another 100,000 into my business to see if I can make it work. So, and he said, I remember something about you securing it. So putting a PPSR and a GSA in place so that when that money goes in, if things don't work, you've still got a better chance of getting it out than it's unsecured.
Yes, so you're a secure creditor. And I think we see a lot of times, I had a client not that long ago where the bank had lent the business $100,000 and they had the full suite of security, right? They had everything you could poke a stick at. The business owner himself had borrowed money against his family home and put it into the business on an unsecured basis. Guess who got their money back?
That's it. So, all those sort of things are the things to be looking at doing now. And, again, ad nauseum, I talk about plan Bs.
Yeah.
Making sure that there is a plan B for, if the business owners have got a plan to move forward, great. But if the plan B is if that doesn't work in such an uncertain market, make sure that you've got some plans in place to protect against that. The old Stephen Covey, start with the end in mind.
Yeah.
Most people think of that conversation about it being a really good end in mind, but you need to think about the other end in mind as well.
I think also for our audience today that a relevant issue may be things like debtor-creditor relationships between the director and related entities and trading entities. So we see a lot of times Division 7A loans and things like that. As you say, what's the plan? Because if something goes wrong with that business, those Division 7A loans may well end up a problem down the track. All right. So right now, even if there's no immediate issue, you can take some steps to manage your personal risks.
Absolutely.
Lots of businesses are having issues right now though, Ash. So let's get back to our topic for the day.
Yep.
We've spoken a bit about supply chain problems. Now let's talk a little bit about staffing issues. Before we do, I'm just going to throw a few statistics at you just for fun. In December, unemployment went down from 4.6 to 4.2%. Now that doesn't cover the latest Omicron wave, but that's the lowest level of unemployment since August 2008, which was just before the GFC. So with everything else that's going on, you've now got at face value a pretty tight labour market. As I say, that doesn't cover the latest surge. And as like any unemployment number, it doesn't really account for underemployment in a real meaningful sort of way.
No, that's pretty interestingly, I heard this morning, Phil, that they're anticipating it to drop to low threes.
Oh, wow. So that'd be historical lows for Australia.
Yeah.
So I think probably a lot of people in our audience today may have heard the phrase that's getting bandied around at the moment called the Great Resignation.
Yep.
What's all that about?
Well, it's an American thing that's going on, and it's become quite a big trend and quite a big issue in America. But they've had something like 20 million people resigned their positions since April 2021, which represents 12% of their total labour market.
That's staggering.
Big numbers, yeah. And I think what COVID's done is that it's got people have started reevaluating their life and then making life choices around, because of being stuck at home, I guess, for weeks and months at a time. You start going, well, what do I want my life to be? So there's been a massive resignation, a massive movement of the workforce. The usual things that anyone on this screen is probably dealing with their offices is workout and burnout, and all those things are causing people to drop out of the market or to do a complete change in what they want to do. And with the faster than expected job recovery, because I think there was a belief that unemployment was going to go up because of COVID, but it's gone the other way. There's a lot more choices in the labour market, which is creating this resignation and turning around of staff.
Yeah, right. So that's originated in America. That's where the Great Resignation came from. Is it likely to happen in Australia as well, Ash?
Look, I don't pretend to be a macroeconomic man, Phil, but look, I think we are starting to see versions of it. I think there was at one stage, rather than calling it the Great Resignation, it was going to be the Great Move. And there's a real moving of staff, moving in positions. And that come about for a couple of reasons, I think, in Australia, is that a lot of businesses put themselves in I'm going to sit and wait and see mode. So there's been no staff growth. You've tried to hold on to the staff you've got. But interestingly, and if you put aside even the hospitality and retail, where we know that there was some massive hit on staff, you've also got the situation now that someone who had a career progression, who said, I'm going to be in this job, then I'm going to move to go back to a restaurant, for instance. They might have started on the floor, thought they'd become the floor manager and might become the restaurant manager. Well, that type of career progression has been put on hold for 2 years. So, and most firms aren't wanting to promote people because they're trying to just stabilise. So, but other firms have got holes in their market for a restaurant manager. So that's where this Great Resignation is occurring. And, in Australia, they had, they're saying that an ABS figure is saying that over 600,000 people will be with new employers in 2022. So that's 5% of our workforce in Australia is going to move. PwC also had a survey saying that they found 38% of people would likely be looking for a new job in the next 12 months.
Wow.
38%. So that puts so much pressure on businesses, in trying to train new staff, find new staff, as well as, let's not even consider the wage pressure that that's going to create. And that's the other issue that will come into play later this year. And we've already seen that play out in some industries already, where the wage pressures have gone up quite considerably. And I think the other issue in our audiences market, we're seeing it in the accounting and legal profession.
I think the other thing, Ash, now is that work from home's become much more of a thing now for the Australian workforce. And there are people that may well change jobs to achieve the sort of work from home mix or balance that they're looking for. And as you've said, you and I were chatting about this the other day, and some people really love work from home. They thrive on it. And other people are the exact opposite. So the needs of even our business here, there'd be a variety of positions by my colleagues on how much work they want from home, if any. So,
and interestingly, the transition from one to the other. I had someone ring me up yesterday who in Queensland who's moved back into the office this week. And I know in Queensland a lot are coming back next week, but technically it opened up, I think, this week in Queensland. And their anxiety level has gone through the roof because they got into a pattern at home. So that creates all sorts of issues in and of itself. And if a business is not flexible, it can create that, well, I'll go and find a firm that is.
Yeah, it's the first time I put on leather shoes for a while. Come in today. So, okay, the Great Resignation. It may be a looming issue, and employers may need to be more flexible to retain employees.
Yep.
Now, everything's got to have a great in front of it, just like every scandal's got to have a gate at the end of it. So we've got the Great Resignation. And the other thing that we've seen in the press lately is what they're calling the Great Slump. What can you tell me about the Great Slump, Ash?
Yeah, this one, I think, and it might sound like it hasn't got much to do with our normal, what we talk about, Phil, but the Great Slump is really around mental health. And, you know, for the last 12 months, it's been and so it should be, a really big conversation piece. But the Great Slump is focused around mental health. The people that are really struggling they're scared to come back into the office, they're scared to be at home, they've got no social interaction. We're still seeing a lot of people not wanting to go out.
Yep.
And, you know, they're scared about going to restaurants, going out into public spaces. Unfortunately, that fear is still there and strong in some. I think it is dissipating a bit from what it was maybe a month ago, but that's having a really significant impact on people mentally, which then leads to lower work productivity. Again, you know, the chances of resignations and all the rest of it. And I don't know, I'll probably get some comments from people around online here, but for me and a lot of people that I've spoken to, it doesn't feel like we've had a holiday. You know, normally you come out of Christmas and the new year and it's a good refreshing break. Most things do stop, particularly in our industry. You know, the courts are shut, you know, lawyers are shut, and so therefore there's really not a lot that happens. But so many people have been talking to me about the fact that they just don't feel refreshed, and it feels like it's just doing a continuation.
Yeah.
And that's what they're talking about, is the mental impact of that flow-through effect and what it's doing to businesses. It's dropping productivity, which is dropping the top line revenues.
Yep.
You know, because productivity goes down, your costs go up in other areas as well. So profit margins are being squeezed all over the place. And it's just slow and micro and little bits at a time that are doing these things to people.
I think in Australia, there was a LinkedIn survey that was done, and that showed that during the lockdown period, 52% of workers took time off for mental health reasons. So 52% took
It's a big number.
That's a really big number. And from what I've read, I think there's sort of two groups of staff or two groups of employees. There's those ones that during COVID, maybe due to absences or some industries who actually did very well out of the COVID period, those people are suffering from burnout because they've had to pick up extra workload to either cover for absences or meet an increase in demand. So you've got maybe half people like that. And the other half of these people are worn out from stressing about whether they're going to keep their job or not, whether the boss can keep making the payroll and pay them. So two very different issues for those staff members, but still contributing to this problem around mental health. Now, Ash, we've established today that you're not a macroeconomist. Right? I also know that you're not a mental health care professional, right? No. So I'll take that on board. But I will say, out of all the people that I've worked with over a very long career, you're one of the people that I've worked with that is most passionate about mental health issues and the health and well-being of your colleagues. And I think it speaks volumes for you.
Thank you.
So when we look at the Great Slump and things like that, what sort of things should business owners be thinking about, or what sort of things should they consider?
Look, a lot of it's just about actually knowing your people, and this sounds really silly, but you know, as business owners, I see quite regularly a lot of people getting so caught in trying to save the business that they actually forget to understand their people and know what's going on in their mind. Like, are they scared about coming back into the office? Do they want to, you know, and I'm a grey-haired old man, and you and I have talked about this a lot of times. So it's still very much of a belief that, you know, I like to get up in the morning, I have my breakfast, I hop in the car, I drive to my office, I do my work, and I drive home. So this work from home thing is very problematic in my mind. But there are other people who can do it very, very well. And finding that balance, and this obviously applies more in the professional world than it does to this work from home thing. Because again, one of the other big things that's happening in the marketplaces at the moment is everyone's talking about work from home, but there's 30 or 40% of jobs in Australia don't allow you to work from home.
Can't do it.
So you're not actually, you can't earn an income, because if you run out of sick leave, if you've been caught 3 or 4 times in the last 12 months in being quarantined at home, and you don't have the ability to work online, then you got no sick leave, and you probably got no annual leave up your sleeve anyway. So, and that impact comes through. So if your clients are in a business where they don't have the ability to work from home, so it's for me in my firm, let's say, if we take it personal, if someone has to quarantine because they're a family member, they can still work from home. There's no issue at all. But there are a lot of businesses out there who have got clients, who have got staff who don't have any annual leave, don't have any sick leave left. So that's actually putting pressure on them because they've had to quarantine, no fault of their own. And I know some that have been quarantined for maybe 10 weeks in the last 12 months, but have never had COVID. Because they were a close contact, or they're just, and all these sorts of things. Got no holidays left. So if you're dealing with businesses that are like that, then you've got to understand that there's probably going to be an impact on them personally, both financially and otherwise. And they may not be able to, pay their mortgages, pay their rents. That has impact. So understanding your staff and the impact that that's having goes a long way to trying to manage against that. Now, it's not always your responsibility to that level. And, and we've spoken on this webinar before about mental health, and please, Lifeline, Beyond Blue, those places are both good to help you understand how to help people, but also to direct people directly to it. So really powerful thing. Finding a way as a manager to manage COVID better and to be present and letting people know that you're on top of trying to manage it is really important as well, because there's a lot of staff have been saying that that's the major concern.
It's come out in a lot of publications and surveys that I've read recently. So look, obviously in a lot of industries, staff shortages have been a big issue, close contact and isolation rules, and they change all the time, they get wound back, but it's still causing a big issue. Now, some things that you and I've spoken about, you more or less expect that you're going to have that types of problems. And we're talking here about hospitality and aged care facilities and certain health professionals that are susceptible to it. But it's happening in a lot of places you wouldn't normally think of, isn't it, Ash?
Oh, absolutely. It's the biggest one that I think most people almost get shocked by is a Rio Tinto just reduced their export expectations because of staff shortages.
Wow.
So it's something that you think is impervious to it in that type of stuff. If you can't get it out of the ground, you can't go and send it anywhere. So those type of things still come into play. It just puts tightness in the labour market everywhere. The schools. I heard of a school the other day that's hired 10 extra relief staff, basically to sit at home and to be brought in if they have a teacher that's been locked out.
Wow.
So that's actually taking people out of the market to try and protect it for themselves. Smart for them, but it puts pressure on a lot of other schools who can't educate because they can't get teachers.
And of course, we've had restrictions in some areas on cross-border travel, particularly in WA, which would be Rio Tinto's.
WA is just a different country now, isn't it? They've abdicated, haven't they already?
I don't know about that. But, you've got restrictions on interstate travel. You've got no new workers coming in from overseas. You've got no backpackers to do some of those casual jobs in various
all the fruit picking.
But a lot of backpackers also work in hospitality. So if hospitality staff are affected through close contact, you might have been able to pick it up from backpackers, but you can't do that anymore.
No.
So it's happening all over the place, and it all contributes to that staff shortage. Now, I believe the NAB Quarterly Business Survey had an interesting statistic on this, didn't it, Ash?
Well, you're making me look at my notes, aren't you, mate? That 85% of firms reported the availability of labour as a constraint on business.
85%. All right, so that's a big issue. Well, mate, you and I are just full of good news today, aren't we? We never talk about the negatives this much, but I think it's important that we put these things into context around the problems that are facing businesses out there at the moment and the uncertainty. And as you say, the need for a plan B. What other stuff's going on, Ash? What else have you got for us?
Yeah, just to finish off the negativity, or to at least for people that understand where these risks sit, is that I think the impact of this unofficial lockdown is probably a lot deeper than we know yet. And again, I think there's that lag of 60 to 90 days. The retail sales are way down because people aren't wanting to go out. You've got some issues with density limits that are still causing grief. In the inner city stuff is just an absolute horror story. No one's in the stores, so the restaurants and everything in the city are just in all cities across the country. The capital cities are causing all sorts of grief. We've got this unknowns around vaccines, and people just aren't spending and going out as much as they are. Yep. And that's having a particular, and again, hospitality, retail, that's obvious. But that leads to a lot of other things. It's like shops aren't then doing shop fit outs. So that whole industry is now slowing down.
Yep.
Along with all these other flow-on effects that you see, because that's not occurring. So we're seeing a lot of liquor suppliers aren't getting the sales now. Although Australians are very good at drinking liquor anyway. But what's happened is that it's the liquor sales in the restaurants and stuff isn't happening. So, I've seen in the court list recently a number of wine distributors that are on the ropes now because the volumes just aren't there. And again, when our listening audiences around is accountants and lawyers, and it's not about someone's gone broke. They are slow. It's a slow break at the moment. What we're seeing is that revenue lines have dropped by 10, 15, 20%. That doesn't kill a business tomorrow.
No.
And then that flows on from there.
I know in my life that my wife is now on a first name basis with half a dozen different delivery drivers, parcels for stuff that she's bought that never goes out of the house. So, mate, some very challenging times.
Yep.
And as I said earlier, I think the uncertainty for business owners of it all is the worst out of all of that. Let's sort of bring it back a little bit to our world. And recently, Ashley, with clients that you've worked with and that your team have worked with, what sort of things have you seen? How have these issues affected some of De Jong Reed's clients?
Yeah, so I guess that to look at a couple of really quick examples of where this has come through is that, we talk about a restaurant bar. It's survived COVID, just heavily impacted, but survived it. But what we found, when the clients came in to see us, they were just tired. They didn't know how long they had to fight on. And you talked at the start about the uncertainty. It's like, how long do you want to fight? How much more money do I need to put in to keep it alive? And originally they came in and talked about what those options were, but it became clear that they were tired. So what we're working on with them is actually just getting out. So we're negotiating an exit with the landlord. The landlord obviously would like to start getting something in there that's being paid. So getting rid of a tenant, even though it's at a loss, and the landlord's not going to get their full whack, they're going to have an ability to find someone that might be able to pay the rent moving forward. So we're negotiating an exit there. We're negotiating with just selling off some of the assets the best way we possibly can.
Yep.
There's always someone who's optimistic who wants to have a go. So there's a lot of these secondhand stuff is still selling quite well at the moment. So helping them do that because of the shortfalls, and again, in this case, they use the ATO to try and survive. We'll end up where we're going to be putting them into liquidation to deal with the rest of the legacy debt. they will then be able to move on with their lives and put this part behind and then move into whatever role they want to do from there.
So as we've discussed before, a controlled exit and negotiations can be an option when you're faced with that sort of situation where the client just lacks the drive or the passion or the desire to go on. Yep. It's always better to manage your affairs and get out in a really controlled and organised sort of way.
Yes.
What about though when people, they've had issues, they've faced some of these problems, but they still have that desire to go on? Do you have an example of someone in that situation?
So we're working with, or started working with a steel fixing business at the moment who, and this is going to be the other issue, they had significant issues with lockdowns and workflow and revenue lines dropping and going up and all those sort of things that we all talked about over the last 12 months. But they found a way of surviving. Again, used the ATO as to help them through that. So it was very generous for the ATO. What's happened is that the first of one of their customers went into liquidation.
Right.
So 20% of their debtor book disappeared overnight through a liquidation. So they've got good forward contracts. They've got out of being caught in the increasing steel prices and the steel fabrication issues that they were having. Yep. So they've now got contracts at the right price for the current pricing. So in this case, it's more about doing a restructure for them than it is to shut them down. So we're going to, I won't go into it now because we are running out of time, but we go through the proper process of a sale with valuations and all the rest of it. Sell the contracts across, get those issued across, and give the fabrication business a second chance of life, leaving behind some of that legacy issue that's created it, particularly on the back of this debtor going down that's just killed the cash flow.
All right, so today we've looked at some of the current issues that we think business owners are facing, and some businesses may not have any of those issues. Others may have one or more of them that they have to deal with right now. Yep. Things like supply chain problems and staffing issues, things can change so quickly. Wouldn't be a great time for the ATO to start or a creditor to start ringing up, would it? And the ATO are starting to ring, at least engaging with taxpayers.
Yep. Yeah, so, well, I think... and to wrap it up, as we're at 2:45 now, Phil. So we like to try and stay as close to on time as we can. And I only say 2:45 because it's all over the country, so it's 2:45 somewhere in whatever hour.
2:45 somewhere.
But I think that I guess the message we want is that there are a whole lot of potential issues, and they're a lot smaller than. It's not the big blow up issue. It's not the tsunami of destruction that we're hearing everywhere. But there is a need for people to be thinking about their plan B options, making sure they've got some personal protections in place, and also making sure that that if they're trying to drive forward, that if that is to fail, do they have the protections in place? The ATO is still being generous. Other trade creditors are starting to push. So my personal belief is that this business confidence is almost a false confidence on the basis that there's no pressure anywhere. Yeah. And I think that there's going to be a driving force that's coming through. There has been in the last couple of weeks a marked increase from my point of view of people going, I'm not sure how this year's going to go. So they're now looking at those options and talking about plan B options. So now I will, for those who might have any questions, if you want to put your hand up, you're using the hand tool thing, whatever. We all know what it is. Press the button, put your hand up, and then we can unmute you, or you can unmute yourself and ask away. There aren't any questions in the chat box at the moment. But I think, so we'll wrap up, I guess, on that and wait to see if there are any questions. Elise has just put up the feedback poll. So please be nice. But for us, I think, and Phil and I have spent a lot of time today talking about all the worries of staff and resignations and slumps and all that sort of thing. We're not saying it because I actually think the world is falling apart. I really aren't. I am believing that there is some great opportunity in all of this, but being aware of all these little things that are having small impacts on businesses is important, because it's the small impacts will lead to bigger issues. And what we're trying to, I guess, identify with you is, as you're talking to your clients, if any of these things pop up, there are options, and pick up the phone, talk to myself, talk to Phil, ring any of the Jonge team, and we can look at what options are available there.